It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our guest speaker today, Luke Forelle. Luke grew up in New York City and Pine Plains. He studied at Buckley and Browning and then at Columbia University, where he majored in philosophy. And just a couple of weeks ago, Luke completed a graduate degree in real estate development at Columbia and is now working full-time at the related companies. Importantly to us here in Lithgow, we are pleased to claim him as one of our own. He was confirmed here at St. Peter's Church and served here as an acolyte. But there is another aspect of Luke's life front and center in our minds in this place today. Luke entered the United States Marine Corps and was commissioned in 2009. A summary of Luke's noteworthy achievements in service to our country are included in today's bulletin. But there is more to the story. So I'll give you a brief illustration of Luke's commitment to service. As part of his preparation for serving in Afghanistan, Luke took it upon himself to study and become proficient in Pashto and in the history, culture, and religion of Afghanistan before touching down in that country. As a result, he could speak with the Afghan elders knowledgeably and in their native language, and by so doing, gain their confidence. As one of his people said, the elders felt a sense of security and greeted him with open arms. I could go on at some length, but will close my introduction with a quote from Captain Bobby Lee, the India Company commanding officer, about Luke's enduring impact among the Afghan elders with whom he interacted. Captain Lee said this: "The Afghan culture is one where people pass on history by word of mouth. In 20 or 30 years, the people of Safar will still remember Commander Luke. They'll recount stories of him over and over again, like his ability to speak Pashto, or the time he wore Afghan clothes to Ashura. He helped carry on a history of good memories surrounding the time Marines spent here." Luke.
Thank you, David, for the wonderful introduction. Thank you to Albert and to T. Nolan. David, who initially reached out to me and asked if I'd like to speak today, again, my apologies for only confirming that I was in fact coming a couple weeks ago. It was a busy time for me. And I think at one point David was unsure if I was actually going to show up. So, and my apologies for not being in my uniform. I was telling Mrs. Corbin just a couple minutes ago that I had fully intended to wear my uniform, replete with the appropriate ribbons and medals. But when I went to put it on, it didn't really even come close to fitting. And something I'll talk about later is that the Marine Corps has a very specific set of norms and beliefs, but maybe primary among them is don't look bad in your uniform. So I try not to fit to my dress blues. My brother Charles and I were, in fact, the very first members of the confirmation class here at St. Peter's, I believe. The congregation was significantly smaller at the time. At least it seemed that way to me. When I come back on Christmas and I look at the congregation as it is today and see that people can barely fit into St. Peter's, it really warms my heart. And it's wonderful to see what I think I read. We call ourselves a little church on a dirt road. It's amazing to see it continue to thrive in the years since my early days as an acolyte. St. Peter's even has a YouTube channel And in thinking about how I'd like to help honor this day, a day when we remember our heroes who died while serving in the United States military, our heroes who gave the ultimate sacrifice, I went on YouTube and I looked at last year's truly moving speech given by Lieutenant Colonel Nicole Drury. And if you haven't seen that speech, I highly recommend that you go and do that. I hope to approach her eloquence and poignancy today. She is a retired Air Force health service provider. She worked in post-operative care for wounded warriors. And she also worked in the famous Battlefield Trauma Center in Balad, Iraq. Balad provided the first echelon of care in a real hospital setting that soldiers and Marines might see after they'd been wounded in action in the Sunni Triangle, which in Iraq was really the most devastating and difficult place to operate. Many of those wounded were likely only a few hours away from the injury from the event that left them injured. But Lieutenant Colonel Drury opened her remarks by saying that she hoped that she'd be able to give her audience last year a sense of what Memorial Day means to her as someone who'd experienced what she'd experienced in Balad. And as a Marine who experienced combat, I'd like to try to do the same thing today. I'm a proud Marine. You wear that title until the day you die. Once a Marine, always a Marine. I'm also proud of being a member of the infantry community. As an infantry member in the Marine Corps, you're taught and you really grow to believe deeply that the rest of the military apparatus literally revolves around you. The infantry is the main effort, the supported effort. Everyone else is supporting. Artillerymen, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, were you an artilleryman? I apologize. The rest of the following lines will be difficult. Artillerymen exist so that they can provide you with supporting fires as you move on the objective. Combat engineers exist so that they can clear a path for you to build a bridge or build a bridge for you as you maneuver on the enemy. Logisticians exist to feed you, provide you ammunition, and ensure you have some access to a level of medical care. We call it beans, bullets, and Band-Aids. The Navy gives you a ride on a ship. The Air Force gives you a ride on a plane. The Army, I'm sorry again, in our mind doesn't really exist. Even the Navy SEALs, the pinnacle of tactical proficiency, only exist so they can prepare the battlefield for you when you come and you do the real work. It's perhaps the cockiest community on planet Earth. I'm proud to be a part of that brotherhood, and though I'm modest by nature, I still find myself unable to shed that brash attitude. And now that I've left the service, my pride is almost uncontainable when I walk with my fellow veterans on Veterans Day parade in the city, which I've done twice. But this weekend is different for me. This weekend is for humility. This weekend, we're all humbled by our heroes when we remember our brothers and sisters in arms who didn't make it back from the battlefield. The ones who gave the ultimate sacrifice. I want to return to that phrase later, the ultimate sacrifice, but that's the phrase that leaders across the country and overseas used on Friday before the Memorial Day long weekend. When first sergeants and sergeants major across all branches reminded that this weekend isn't about just barbecuing and drinking beer. It's not just 72 hours away from work. It's an opportunity to reflect. We've assembled here today for reflection. And one of the traditions we follow today, decorating the graves of our service members with flowers, helps us in that process. It dates back to the Civil War. Women would gather around grave sites and decorate headstones. Remembrance Day and Anzac Day from our brothers in the Commonwealth Nation, kind of the equivalent to Memorial Day. That's also strongly associated with flowers and decorating graves. In fact, Remembrance Day is known as Poppy Day. That imagery created from John McCrae's war poem In Flanders Fields, in which McCrae describes red poppies almost immediately sprouting up from a World War I battlefield gravesite. I'll come back to that association later as well. But first, I'd like to describe how Marines think about sacrifice. There's a level of commitment to the Corps that comes with the territory. The Marine Corps insignia, the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor, is earned by all Marines by virtue of graduating from boot camp or officer candidate school, which are tough rites of passage in their own way. But from then on, the level of commitment to the Corps that a Marine possesses is judged by the type and magnitude of the hardships that they face and the sacrifices that they make. The greatest admiration is not always given to the unit or the individual Marine with the most tactical prowess, the most technical skill, or the most physical strength. True admiration in the Marine Corps is reserved for the ones who have endured. In our parlance, the ones who've had the tough duty. My generation of Marines, for instance, the ones who've had the tough duty was 3-5, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines out of Camp Pendleton, California. Their deployment preceded mine by a few months. In 2010, their battalion lost 25 Marines and 185 Marines were wounded. The men of Dark Horse Regiment, as they're known across the Corps now, are the ones who've sacrificed so much. But here was my tough duty. I deployed as a platoon commander of 3rd Platoon, India Company, 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines. We deployed to the far reaches of southern Helmand Province in Afghanistan. The district was called Garmsir. This was the fall of 2011. My platoon operated out of 5 very small patrol bases that had been created over the course of the previous year. A very bloody and difficult year for the units that came before us. In comparison to the large forward operating bases in other parts of the country, the bases we worked from were pretty austere. The base we initially flew into before we continued down to Garmsir, I remember it well. You could choose between 5 dining facilities, one of which really catered towards the Indian and Bangladeshi contractors who populated the base and worked there. It was so large that it required a group of contractors from overseas to run it. Our position, we ate the same prepackaged meals over and over. Sometimes it was augmented by food from the locals. That's where my Pashto probably came in most handy. But we went the duration of the deployment without showering, and we rarely slept. One of my positions was manned by a group of 12 Marines and 1 Navy corpsman. They lived on Thomas Hill, an elevated mound of dirt that I know well, on which you could fit 13 cots, a couple sandbags, and a small bench where we set up a radio post. When I would spend the night there, I'd just wedge between 2 cots and sleep on the ground. That little base was named after Corporal Matthew Thomas, a combat engineer with the British Special Forces who died clearing the hill of improvised explosive devices, which are makeshift mines. He died on September 25th, 2010. roughly a year before I took responsibility of that outpost. The Marine I assigned as position commander of Thomas Hill was 20 years old. He was a Lance Corporal. Due to the tactical importance of the hill and its surrounding villages, I put the Marines at Thomas Hill on a near constant patrol schedule. By NATO rules and tactical common sense, the minimum number of Marines on a patrol was 4. The minimum total number of participants in a patrol was 12. So that could include augments from the Afghan National Army or Afghan Special Forces. But there always had to be 4 Marines at a time. So remember, there were 13 guys at this base. So 4 were always patrolling. Another 4 were guarding the base. Another 1 was manning the radio. So that left 3 to sleep. Every single patrol that left the wire needed a corpsman, and they only had 1. That was Hospital Corpsman Chase Reeves, who logged between 3 and 4 patrols a day for 2 months straight. Patrols usually lasted between 4 and 6 hours. Sometimes they were longer. So do the math. Either he didn't sleep or he slept for a couple hours. At one point, we were trying to rid the district of the last remnants of the Taliban cells that had been operating there for years. We were also attempting to interface with as many local village elders as possible. The goal was to convince them that there was something to gain by siding with us, aligning themselves with the national government of Afghanistan. It was a tough sell. And because of IED activity in the area, one member of a patrol always had to carry a 25-pound box called a Thor. A Thor would jam radio frequencies within a certain radius. We did that so that a Taliban lookout couldn't remotely detonate an IED with a radio device. Someone else would carry a handheld mine detector, always walking ahead of the patrol, constantly sweeping the ground. The sweeper would also carry what we called a sickle, which was an 8-foot-long piece of bamboo with a curved saw blade at the end. It was our most primitive but effective tool in the war against IEDs, because despite all the technology that we brought to bear, the Taliban were still pretty successful. They stopped trying to remotely detonate the devices once they figured out that these weird backpacks jam their radio frequencies, and they stopped burying the large pack of D-cell batteries that powered the devices right next to the buried explosives. So the D-cell batteries were the only thing that our mine detectors could find, and the Taliban would bury them 15 or 20 feet away from a pressure plate and connect the battery pack to the explosives. They connect it with a run of lamp cord. So we'd use the sickle to try to unearth the lamp cord. When we felt as though we were in an area with IEDs, the sweeper would sweep and then scrape the ground with the sickle, trying to unearth the lamp cord and identify the mine below. Someone would also carry a radio equipment to talk back to Thomas Hill or the platoon position, or maybe call for air support. Doc Reeves carried a big medical bag. By the early spring, when the local farmers flooded their crops, we decided that walking on a dry path and sweeping and sickling was ultimately less efficient and more dangerous than just trudging through miles and miles of muddy fields. So that's what we did. Most of the time the fields were wheat, and sometimes they were poppy. Poppy fields were a sign that the Taliban, who used the proceeds of opium sales to fund their operations, was still present. We became obsessed with finding the worst possible route to an objective. We figured it was the least likely path for the Taliban to target. So we still carried all the extra equipment on top of our 60 or 70 pound combat load. We didn't really need it because we were usually chest deep in a canal trying to outsmart the Taliban. Our deployment progressed like that for months. Some progress, in fact, much progress was made with the local people and the Afghan army personnel we were tasked with training got a little bit more proficient every day. We had some difficult moments. We would occasionally lose our little cat and mouse game with the Taliban. The 20-year-old Lance Corporal who was in charge of Thomas Hill, by that point he'd been promoted to corporal, stepped on an IED and lost both his legs. He was flown home by way of a hospital, much like the one that Lieutenant Colonel Drury talked about last year. 2 other Marines were also hurt, and I was knocked unconscious by that same blast that wounded Corporal Carnes. More dramatically, I think civilian casualties in our area started to mount as the Taliban realized that the local populace was telling us where the IEDs were. So they stopped giving them advance warning about the location of IEDs that they'd been placed. At one point, a pickup truck carrying a dozen villagers drove over an IED. The Taliban were targeting the tractors that the Afghan equivalent of the DEA used to rip up poppy fields. When these events would happen, the villagers would rush their dead and wounded to the nearest Marine post, and we try to stabilize them before putting them on helicopters bound for a trauma center. Our relationship with our Afghan partners, despite progressing, was always troubled, fraying and nearly coming to a breaking point when a member of their unit shot and killed a Marine at another base over a perceived slight. The Afghan soldier fired as the Marine was working out on his base's makeshift gym. But for India Company, everyone made it. Everyone in my platoon returned home. In May of 2012, I was on a patrol with the incoming platoon commander from the next unit, effectively giving him a tour of the battle space. And we patrolled with one of my squads, laden with the same gear as usual, out of Combat Outpost Rankle, named after Sergeant John Rankle, who died during the battle to clear Safar Bazaar. We walked past Thomas Hill through a series of villages that I'd come to know intimately. At one point, we passed the site where a Marine from 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines had struck an IED and died. His name was Corporal Nicholas Ott. The field there had poppies in full bloom. As we honor all of our service members today who made the ultimate sacrifice, I'd like to say the names of some of the heroes in whose footsteps I walked in Afghanistan and some who I knew personally. Sergeant John Rankle, Corporal Nicholas Ott, First Lieutenant Scott Fleming, Corporal Joe Reitzman, and PFC Casey Holmes. Thank you.